So here is Professor Ahbel-Rappe on Socrates and Shantideva.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Don. Such an honor. And I really go back to the time that you and I were talking about how little we thought that egoism was able to encompass the philosophy of Socrates. So, and this talk is very much harkens back to those days and the years that I met you before. But it also relates to some comparative work, as Don said. So I want to just share a little bit of a PowerPoint with you, which is, let's see if this can, yeah. So this is what I'm going to do today is kind of part of a larger work that I'm working on, is Dialogues Buddhist and Platonist. And I'm going to be comparing these two texts, the Bodhicaryaavatara of Shantideva, an 8th century Indian monk, and Plato's Republic. And eventually I'm going to produce a kind of comparative study of both of these works, as they are a kind of summary of, on the one hand, Buddhist virtue ethics and Platonic virtue ethics. But today I'm going to focus on, and I wanted to say that this is also part of I belong to a group of Buddhist Platonist scholars, and we meet virtually, kind of like the Socrates Symposium, once a month to talk about how Buddhism and Platonism can work together and how we can have a dialogue. So what I want to do, though, is to focus in on the idea of the bodhisattva. In Buddhism, the bodhisattva is the person who is dedicated to saving all sentient beings and delays his or her final enlightenment so that she can serve all beings and to bring them to mature their aspirations, to bring them to final enlightenment. And this figure of the bodhisattva, I think we find this also in the Greek tradition, right? And here I'm thinking of Damascus, this little quote I have from Damascus on the screen, flying down from the vault of heaven. He's talking about the soul of his teacher, Isidore. And, Damascus's philosophical history is a celebration of Isidore. It was called The Life of Isidore. And in that same way, then, I take it that Plato also is celebrating the life of his teacher, Socrates. And in this work, I'll be talking about the figure of Socrates, both in terms of Plato's Socratic dialogues, but also the figure of Socrates as the compassionate philosopher who goes down to save sentient beings. So as I said, here is Damascus talking about his teacher, Isidore. And he says, flying down from the vault of heaven, the soul of Isidore, attached itself to life on earth. And I thought he was shouting as it descended into generation, I have arrived here from a better place. So we this feeling of arriving from a better place, we see this in the Republic. And of course it's crucial to to Shantideva's work and to Plato's Republic. So, I want to start by saying that the very first word of Plato's Republic, kat eben, I went down, anticipates that third wave in Book 4 of the Republic, where Socrates raises the problem of the philosopher's reluctance to rule Callipolis by fronting the entire work with this word, kat eben, that prefigures descent into the cave, one that also anticipates the myth of and his descent into the underworld to witness the springs of justice operate through the process of transmigration. Plato calls attention to what we might think of as the philosopher's choice, to minister to the needs of the ignorant cave dwellers, rather than enjoying the fruits of her enlightenment in contemplative bliss. Indeed, the philosopher's choice is the paradox at the heart of the Republic, precisely because the work unfolds as an account of why the life of justice makes the just person happier. And the system of virtue ethics of Book 4 demonstrates the inner workings of justice as a life that offers the greatest chance of psychological harmony, owing to the satisfaction of one's necessary desires. So why begin the book, the Republic, with the one place in that system, Plato's third wave, the tsunami of unhappiness that seems to threaten Callipolis's foundations, since the philosopher's choice will seem to be the greatest exception to the overall argument of the book. So that's what I want to talk about today, this philosopher's choice and the Republic, with another foundational text on virtue ethics, the 8th century Buddhist philosopher Shantideva's Bodhicaryaavatara, or Entering the Path of Enlightenment. And I would like to say that, this book is the third most translated Buddhist text in the entire world. And so, for that reason alone, I think that those of us who are interested in comparative philosophy really should look at these two works, the Republic and the Bodhicaryaavatara, we'll call it the BCA, side by side. I think it really teaches us a lot about the Republic. So Shantideva attended the Buddhist University of Nalanda in Gujarat and supposedly recited his Sanskrit poem, which is the Bodhicaryaavatara, composed in the shloka meter, spontaneously after being challenged by his colleagues. When he reached verse 934, let's see, I don't know, do I have it here? Oh yes, when he reached verse 934, which is, when neither an entity nor a non-entity remain before thought, then thought with no object is pacified because it has no other destination. When he reached that verse, he rose into the air and his body disappeared. The remainder of the text was recited by a disembodied voice. And I think there that we can also make some comparisons with Socrates. So central to the ethics of the BCA is this project of becoming a bodhisattva and then a fully awakened Buddha. The bodhisattva, an enlightened being, comes into the world for the promise of bringing all sentient beings into enlightenment. The bodhisattva ideal is behind the formation of the Mahayana, or Great Vehicle School of Buddhism. And Shantideva's text, For Better or Worse, valorizes this aspiration and develops an ethics that is suitable for someone with this intention, formerly known as bodhicitta, the desire for enlightenment, the mind of one who is intent on benefiting others through her own awakening. And in calling it the Bodhicaryaavatara an ethical system, I mean that it recommends a developmental program of virtue, starting with dana, generosity, shila, moral control, kshanti, patience, virya, bravery, courage, dhyana, concentration, and prajna, wisdom. As with Plato virtue ethics, so here all virtues culminate in the highest virtue, which is wisdom. But the foundation for this entire aspiration is actually very similar to the foundational importance of the prudential principle that operates in Plato's ethics. The desire that everyone has to be happy, to be free from suffering. Chapter 8 of the treatise, The Perfection of Meditation, contains Shantideva's arguments for a radically altruistic position that is grounded in what he terms the sama dukha sukhaa sarveheh, that is, the equality of all beings with respect to well-being and suffering. For Shantideva, this sameness of all beings in their desires for well-being is construed as foundational for the Bodhisattva's vow. And there's some other broad comparisons that, as I said, I'm interested in drawing with the Republic, having to do with the unity of the virtues, the limits of egoism, and the problems of rebirth, which I'll talk about today. And also this contrast between the conventional and absolute truth that is really at the heart of both the Republic and Shantideva. How does the world appear from the point of view of doxa versus episteme, and for Shantideva, it's some vertisat and ultimate paramartisat truth, and how the idea that essentially the problem is, for Shantideva, ultimate truth posits that there are no beings to save. So how can you save them? And in a similar way, we might wonder about how the philosopher, as a reward for her a life well lived, will end up with her bureaucratic duties assigned to her, as if in punishment for all that she's done for others. So in the time that remains today, I want to talk about the dialectical deployment of the prudential principle in each work. So I'm going to just now end my my screen share here of my little PowerPoint, and just go back to go to the handout, if that's okay with you, which I've given to you, and then you can let's see, follow along with me on the handout. And okay, so we've gotten to the tsunami, which is passage 2, right? This tsunami of unhappiness that threatens to destroy Kallipolis. And now we are talking about the prudential principle. So, I mean, I obviously don't need to tell you that there's this widespread idea that classical Greek ethics, and especially the ethics of Socrates, is largely or even entirely eudaimonist in structure. For example, in his influential work, Plato's Ethics, Terrence Irwin summarizes the ethical position to which he thinks Socrates is committed in Plato's dialogue, Charmides and Euthydemus, as follows. And this is the handout number 3, T3. In all our rational actions, we pursue our own happiness. And it says, and he also says that if we do not pursue our own happiness, we are not acting rationally. So you can read about some of the other commitments of egoistic eudaimonism that Irwin talks about. But I think this is a kind of, this text, Irwin's interpretation of Socrates, is kind of cautionary for me. I find it really wrong-headed. And today what I want to do is talk about how it is that the prudential principle is really misused by those who promulgate egoistic eudaimonism. And I want to do that by showing you a very different deployment of the prudential principle that we find in Shantideva's work. Okay, so so in a kind of thought experiment then, we're going to interrogate Socratic / Platonic ethics by studying the eudaimonist implications of the so-called prudential principle, the principle that everyone desires the good, in light of Shantideva's Bodhicaryaavatara. So what I'm first going to do is to discuss the work that the prudential principle is commonly made to do in rational eudaimonist accounts of Platonic Socratic ethics. And then I'm going to contrast the altruism that's inherent in Shantideva's treatment of what he calls the sama, dukha, sukhaa, sarveheh, the equality of all beings with respect to their desire for well-being, with the purportedly egoistic implications of the Socratic doctrine that all desire is for the good. My purpose is to suggest that rational eudaimonist interpretations are not in any way adequate for understanding the importance of the prudential principle in the Platonic dialogues, in the Platonic Socratic dialogues. In the second part of this paper, I compare the function of arguments from transmigration in Shantideva's text and in Plato's Republic in terms of how such arguments are used to undermine strictly egoistic accounts of rational motivation. The paper concludes with a discussion of the virtue of equanimity as discussed by both authors. I don't know if we'll get there, but I would like to suggest that the prudential principle has the intended, though not necessarily realized, goal of creating an association between persons who will the good, based on the shared awareness that everyone desires the good. This awareness that everyone desires the good has its own motivating force that can be expressed as the desire to benefit others. And as we see in the Philosopher's Choice, fundamental to Platonic ethics in the Republic is this orientation to extend the good, So part one, the prudential principle. So we talked before about Irwin, and we talked about Vlastos. I haven't talked about Vlastos, my teacher at Berkeley, when I was a graduate student there. But very famously, he says in his essay, Happiness and Virtue, in note 14, when he's talking about the Gorgias, and he's talking about T4 on the handout, he says, here desire for happiness is strictly self-referential. It is the agent's desire for his own happiness and that of no one else. This is so deep-seated an assumption that it is simply taken for granted. No argument is ever given for it in the Platonic corpus. So yeah, I find that really really shocking that essentially he admits that it's not even argued for. So we need to interrogate this, and I want to here now in these quotes now in the handout that I'm trying to share with you now. T4 is to give you the textual evidence for the importance of the prudential principle in the Socratic dialogues, right? So the prominence of the prudential principle in a number of Socratic elenchi in the Gorgias. When we slaughter or banish from the city or deprive of property, we will the good, not what is neither good nor evil, nor what is evil. Protagoras, to make for what no one believes to be evil, instead of making for the good, is not, it seems, in human nature, Meno. Isn't it true that everyone obviously desires the good? Does anybody wish to be happy, unhappy, and unfortunate? Meno, I suppose not. Euthydemus, T4. Who in the world does not wish to do well? Not a single one, said Clinias. A glance at these texts, which in your handout, did you find them? Or I'm sharing them on the screen, but I also gave you the handout. We're at the end here. Does anybody want to be unhappy and unfortunate? I suppose not. Euthydemus. Do we all wish to do well in the world? Who in the world does not wish to do well? Not a single one. So a glance at these texts, which, as I said, are the principal support for the importance of the prudential principle, and hence the inference from the prudential principle that people are interested in their own well-being, primarily, exclusively, in the Socratic dialogues. Socrates doesn't argue for the truth of the premise that all people wish to be happy. He fears it might even be foolish, as we see in T7. It's foolish to argue for it. Because interlocutors always agree to the prudential principle, because it is seemingly indefeasible, Socrates crucially deploys it in a number of elenchic refutations, as 4 through 7 show. He uses it in conjunction with other elenchic principles, which I won't get into today. I think you all are familiar with that. So interpreted in this light, Socrates is making a point about the structure of motivations. People are motivated to act with a view to enhancing their own well-being. Now, what I want to say is that the matter cannot be settled so easily, for we should consider the possibility that in pointing out this fact about other people, the fact that they want to do well, certain ethical consequences follow. It may be a general truth about persons that they wish to do well, but it does not follow that the only implication of this principle for one's life is that one should advance his or her own well-being. Rather, one could observe this feature about other persons and as a result, refrain from harming them. Moreover, one can observe that in this respect, one person is much like another. All wish to be free from suffering and to enjoy well-being. Finally, far from concluding that a given person ought to advance her own happiness on understanding that everyone wishes to be happy, a person might respond by noticing that in this regard, she is like every other person in the world There is nothing special or unique or privileged about her regard for her own welfare. In other words, the act of pointing out that people wish to be happy, or the implicit realization that people wish to be happy, does not, in and of itself, guarantee that a given ethical position is structurally eudaimonist. So, to cast a different light on the implications of the eudaimonist principle in the Socratic dialogues, then I do wish to take you on an excursion to India, to the 8th century, to be exact, at a time when the Buddhist poet and monk Shantideva wrote his famous treatise, the Bodhicaryaavatara. He wrote this compendium of Mahayana philosophy at the very zenith of the madhymaka school, whose obsession with the absolute is perhaps matched only by the Greek philosophical tradition inaugurated by Parmenides. And we saw already this quote that I gave you from chapter 8. Let's look at this again. Shantideva: one should first earnestly meditate on the equality of oneself and others. In this way, all equally experience suffering and happiness. Likewise, different beings with their joys and sorrows are all equal, like myself, in their yearning for happiness. So we saw already, right, that this principle is enunciated in terms of a similar formulation in the Socratic dialogues. It is expressed as a universal desire to be free from suffering. Does anybody want to be unhappy or unfortunate? Me, no. I suppose not. Socrates: then if no, nobody desires what is evil. Nobody wants to suffer. So here we see in Shantideva something like the Socratic claim that all beings desire to be free from suffering. But now in Shantideva, it is deployed in order to support a doctrine of radical altruism. We might say that just keeping this fact in mind about other beings, that they all wish to be happy, will help me to see that each makes a claim upon all. By regarding them as beings who wish to be happy, who have independent subjectivities, lives, projects, then I begin to see them and myself with greater equanimity. I begin to meditate on the equality of myself with others. For the Buddhist philosopher, the idea that everyone wishes to be happy does not lead one to consider his own happiness, how to promote her own happiness, or how to promote her own happiness primarily. Much less does it lead to the conclusion that it is irrational for me to promote another's happiness for its own sake. Now, it might be worth pausing here to consider in more detail the structure of the claim that all beings are alike with respect to their desires for weal and their aversion to woe. For Shantideva, the argument begins with a recognition that suffering and well-being are common to all beings. But in this case, Shantideva suggests that this fact, that one that is presumably empirically obvious and requires no special argument, it's just self-evident, leads to a conclusion. Then there is an equality of self and other with respect to this condition. Sama dukha sukhaa sarveheh. So in this respect, I am the same as all beings. The next step introduces a second premise, this time connected to the desires of all beings. Although all beings experience both weal and woe, in fact, they all want to enjoy well-being. So here we encounter yet another feature about beings. Their desires are structured in a certain way. Since I am a being, then my desires are structured in this very same way. So now you might think, wow, that's crazy, Sarah. I mean, I get that in this Buddhist text where, he specifically is talking about the moral development of the bodhisattva, where the final goal is to raise the bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment that desires to foster all sentient beings. Contrast Socrates, where do we find any hint of altruism? Or indeed, where does Socrates specifically explore the altruistic implications of the prudential principle in the texts? And I know that a lot of you have been working on this topic for, and you even had a conference about it. So I don't need to go into this, but I do want to just talk a little bit about some of our foundational texts here, just to at least maybe get the conversation going. So we could think about Crito 49a right here on the handout. Crito, Socrates says, do we say that one must never do we say that one must never willingly do wrong, adikain? Or does it depend on circumstances? So when we look at this text, T9, we can notice that it's not tied to a theory of eudaimonia. Socrates simply states that it's wrong to harm another. In fact, by stipulating that one must never harm, irrespective of the surrounding circumstances, Socrates makes clear that this principle of non-harm cannot be tied to a theory of eudaimonism, of how such non-harm benefits the agent for its justification. It is prior to all such considerations. And Crito says, and Socrates says, we will start archomata, we will begin our deliberations from this foundational principle, archomata and tothen in the Greek. So, in short, what we may find is behind the elenchic deployment of the prudential principle that persons wish to do well, is the import that this claim, namely your claim to well-being, will have on the way I live my life. If I respect you, I won't violate this claim. If I am stepping on your toes and you say to me, ouch, that hurts, I have a good reason to stop stepping on your toes. Your claim provides me with a constraint on my actions. In this sense, Socratic ethics often functions in the dialogues as an ethics of self-restraint, of leaving undone what otherwise might have promoted one's own advantage. So Socrates begins with something, and virtually all of his interlocutors consider self-evident, not worth disputing. The universal desire to be happy. The Socratic elenchus involves a pointing out of this feature, that they wish to be happy. It follows that it's wrong to harm them, or in other words, to commit injustice. In this sense, there are ethical implications of the prudential principle that extend beyond eudaimonism and provide ethical guideposts for my actions that cannot be motivated by my concern for my own well-being. There is an implicit contrast between the subjective recognition of the eudaimonist principle, that all people wish to be happy, in the sense that it might be immediately obvious to me that I wish to be happy, and a more objective application. The move is from a form of egoism to a greater awareness of the needs and desires of those who are outside of my own egoistic ambit. So I guess for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into T10, but we can talk about T10 in the discussion, which is sort of Socrates' eudaimonist argument that we will mar the soul by harming others. And that does seem to be eudaimonist. So I want to just now continue on a little bit more with my discussion of Shantideva while there's time, if that's okay with you. So what I want to talk about now is the transmigration of happiness, and how the work of the myth of in Plato's Republic also, for me, is very resonant with Shantideva's Bodhicaryaavatara, as we'll see in a second, very specifically. In verses 90 through 117 of chapter 8, the perfection of patience, Shantideva develops a number of arguments that might remind us of Parfit's reasons and persons, or Nagel's the possibility of altruism. Shantideva argues for the altruistic implications of his first premise, the sama dukha sukhaa sarveheh. What kinds of strategies does he employ? First, Shantideva suggests that suffering must be eliminated. Suffering must be eliminated no matter who suffers. If it makes sense to eliminate my own suffering, then I have those same reasons to alleviate all suffering, the suffering of another. In other words, I have reason to eliminate suffering, not because it is I who experience it, but just because it is suffering, and hence the object of rational avoidance. Verse 97 employs an argument from future states of self to show that the suffering of other selves should matter to me. Let's look at verse 97 of the Bodhicaryaavatara here on the handout. 897. If I do not protect them, because I am not afflicted by their suffering, sorry, I'm just going to move this handout so I can see it more clearly. Then why do I protect my body from the suffering of a future body, from that which is not my pain? The notion it is the same me even then is a false construction, since it is one person who dies and quite another who is born. So Shantideva's strategy works in two competing directions. In one way, Shantideva emphasizes the discontinuity of self-identity. Given the doctrine of anatta, of no self in Buddhism, the question of ownership over states of well-being or ill-being, of pain or welfare, becomes moot. Generally, there is no one to whom such states belong, and the fragmentation of self-identity over time within one's lifespan demonstrates the poor logic of arguing for the priority of states that happen to belong to oneself. In other words, this is what he's saying. He's saying, look, I protect my body from the suffering of a future body, which is not my pain. He's talking about either the future suffering of a future birth, or he's talking about, say, like the fact that maybe now I'll take calcium supplements to avoid osteoporosis that might set in 10 years later. So, and the other strategy though is based on the idea of non-continuity of self-identity over a succession of lives. Here we find an argument that invokes the transmigration of the soul. Suppose I have reason to care about the future suffering undergone by the person who, it turns out, it will be realized as a future incarnation. Given the doctrine of transmigration, it is possible to talk about this self or owner coming to be the referent of future states of well-being that are realized in other lives. If so, then, Shantideva argues, I have just as much reason to care about contemporary other selves. I have reason to care about other contemporary selves for the same reason that I care about future selves, whose lives are nevertheless not my life. I am able to identify their welfare or suffering as objects of concern for me. Plato, it seems, does the same thing to defeat the strictures of the narrow eudaimonism that are presented at the outset of the Republic. Ur's report of the future tyrant, the reincarnation of someone who pursued a virtuous life out of habit, but not out of philosophy, is meant to elicit compassion and fear. The implication is that we do care for the happiness of what would presumably be an indefinite number of other selves, of people who are not in any way oneself, viz. those whose incarnations will turn on the choices now made in a present incarnation. So let's look at this handout. Number 12. He was one of those who had come down from heaven, a man who had lived in a well-ordered polity in his former existence, participating in virtue by habit and not by philosophy. And we may perhaps say that a majority of those who were caught were of the company that had come from heaven, inasmuch as they were unexercised in suffering. This person, a successful person in a successful community, like Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I live, or maybe like the universities that you all belong to, is brought to us as an object of both pity and fear, and perhaps ridicule, in the tragic comic pageant that closes the Republic. Recall that in this passage, Plato is presenting us with concluding arguments that relate to the question of whether or not the life of justice is more conducive to happiness than the life of injustice. At this juncture, Plato discusses the posthumous curriculum of the soul. Why does Plato leave us with the consideration that we must look to future births in order to see whether or not our lives have gone well? Presumably we, if we do undergo a future birth, will have no recognizable affinity with that other birth. We will have consumed a full measure of lethe. We will be completely different people with no memories of our previous lives, our gender, our fortunes, and even our species are all subject to change through the process of transmigration, our future self will not in any meaningful way be us. True, Plato says that it will be the same soul who undergoes each successive birth. But this notion of soul is highly underdetermined. So how do we construe the Platonism, the eudaimonism of Plato or Socrates? Here we are looking at an eschatology that posits a continuity, not exactly of self, but posits a causal relationship between the life choice in one person's life and the life choice to be realized in a distinct and separate person, or indeed living being's life. What reason do I have to be concerned with the life of another person when my life, and indeed the lives of those around me, have gone so incredibly well that we are fortunate enough to be naive and, as Plato tells us, inexperienced in suffering? We've never even tasted it. What relationship is there between my present lack of suffering and the future suffering of this as yet unborn tyrant who is evidently a separate self? How does eudaimonism even accommodate this example? And even if we admit that eudaimonism is not limited to narrow self-interest and that eudaimonism is not inherently egoistic, this example from the Republic, with this implication that an indefinite number of other selves can function as a test for how my life as a whole is going, seems strangely out of place in a eudaimonist world. After all, if a eudaimonist asks, "How is my life going?" presumably she will not normally also ask, "How will the lives of all and every subsequent incarnation go?" In fact, for Aristotle's version of eudaimonism, this example from the Republic fits rather poorly. And this is from the Nicomachean Ethics. For Aristotle, the conception of one's life as a whole informs the value of happiness. Happiness is stable and self-sufficient. Autarkeia is the word that Aristotle uses. We stipulate that the happy life will be self-sufficient, but not in the sense that the individual is cut off or attending only to his own happiness. It relates to parents, lives, a wife, and children. But Aristotle says we must put a limit to this. He says we don't extend it to parents and descendants and friends, because otherwise it would go on infinitum, right? It's got to be self-sufficient. It's got to be limited. So I would argue that Plato's argument in the Republic is precisely structured to skew the consequentialism of the preceding books, and indeed to skew the very inquiry that the interlocutors undertake in the first place. The interlocutors demand to know why they're better off choosing a life of justice. That is, why justice is intrinsically better than injustice for the agent. Now, we know, of course, that the person in our example, the philosopher who comes down from heaven, is someone who is just owing to habit. It is because he lacks discernment about what is actually valuable that he cannot see through the apparent benefits of tyranny to the concomitant evils that such a state brings in its train. The person who comes down from heaven chooses tyranny, and yet it is another person who must suffer the consequences of his choice. What other person? The person whose rebirth will take place in what will be a distinctly different life. In a similar way, then, Shantideva argues. Shantideva's opponent in the Bodhicaryaavatara attempts to distinguish between one's eudaimonist commitments to future births versus one's possible obligations to alleviate the sufferings of contemporary other selves. As we have seen, Shantideva blocks this objection. He says, if one thinks that a person's suffering should be warded off by himself, since the pain of a foot is not that of a hand, why I'm sorry, this isn't the one. This isn't the text that I wanted. It was one that I cited earlier. Let me just see if I can. Shantideva says, the notion, it is the same me even then is a false construction, since it is one person who dies and quite another who is born. And the Sanskrit there is anya murto, anya prajayate. One person born, another one who dies. So Shantideva's text begins with this inculcation of equanimity that arises upon seeing the equality of self and other. For Shantideva, this is preliminary work that becomes the foundation for the radical altruism of the Bodhicaryaavatara. Part of the foundation of this equality is the Buddhist doctrine of anatta, of no self. The topic of self and other, of who ultimately is the owner of pain and joy, of weal and woe, is one that no Platonist who hopes to investigate the parameters of ancient eudaimonism can afford to ignore. Ultimately, a more complete discussion of this question would have to take into account how Plato's metaphysics, including his understanding of the status of particulars, would enter into the eudaimonist hypothesis. So I don't think we can separate the Socratic eudaimonism from the Platonic denial that the particular self is our true self. In Shantideva's text, the opponent attempts to distinguish between the owners of various states of weal and woe on the basis of individual identity. But Shantideva replies that the distinctions between selves do not apply in cases of deciding whose pain one is addressing. Rather, one should dispel pain simply because it is pain. Why should suffering be prevented? Because everyone agrees. If it must be warded off, then all of it must be warded off. And if not, then this goes for oneself as it does for everyone else. Within the larger ethics of the Mahayana, this chapter on the perfection of meditation is part of Shantideva's efforts to arouse the mind of bodhicitta, the aspiration to save all sentient beings within the person who is attracted to the path of Buddhism. Some of the arguments in this section of the text depend, as we saw, on the metaphysical doctrine of no self. In 102, all sufferings are without an owner because they are not different. They should be warded off simply because they are suffering. Why is any restriction made in this case? Now, as I mentioned at the outset, there are some contemporary scholars, especially a guy named Paul Williams, and you'll see his books at the end of the handout. If you want to study Shantideva, I have some books that you can look up. They've pointed to the contradiction inherent in the competing claims that one should be devoted to the welfare of all sentient beings because there's nothing special about one's own suffering. And the idea that we find in madhymaka metaphysics that we could compare to Plato, that there are no sentient beings to save. Perhaps, according to Williams, one says that conventionally, that is according to appearances, there are, let us say, people to save. People in the cave, for example. Still, if the bodhisattva is fully enlightened, she will know that ultimately there are no sentient beings. There are no beings endowed with permanent selves. So, in that case, how can she accept the argument that she must be devoted to their well-being? And since at the level of conventional truth, it seems that there are such beings, then what precludes her from taking her own suffering more seriously? After all, she will seem to suffer it, but not theirs. In verses 99 through 101 of the Bodhicaryaavatara, which is T15 on the handout, we encounter an argument that may well remind us of later Stoic conceptions of the cosmopolis, in which all benefits are said to belong to the community of the wise, and all detriments are said to belong equally to the community of the ignorant. First, the verses of Shantideva. If one thinks a person's suffering should be warded off by himself, since pain of the foot is not of the hand, why should the one take care of the other? If one argues that even though it is inappropriate, it happens because of a grasping onto a self, our response is, with all one's might, one should avoid that which is inappropriate, whether it belongs to oneself or to another. Here, it seems that the argument in Shantideva turns on creating an analogy with the idea of a cosmic organism. Just as one person takes care of an entire body, not distinguishing between the pain of its different parts, so the sage will attend to the well-being of all selves, making no distinctions between whose suffering is at stake. The reason for this omnibenevolence is that the bodhisattva does not grasp a self. He is not particularly attached to his own well-being, but promotes well-being simply because it is well-being. In the later Hellenistic tradition, the cosmopolis, the community of rational beings who share all goods in common, might offer a model that better captures the idea expressed in the verses of Shantideva. And in the Republic itself, the provisions of Book 5 suggest that the philosopher will inculcate a similar attitude among citizens by disallowing the use of first-person singular statements to describe states of well-being. Conclusion: the myth of the Bodhisattva. What are we to make of William's criticisms that the metaphysics of enlightenment preclude the ethics of compassion? There isn't time to solve this puzzle here, except to say that what I hope to have shown at the very least is that both the Republic and the Bodhicaryaavatara valorize the figure of the Bodhisattva, the enlightened being dedicated to the supreme welfare of her fellow cave dwellers. In my view, this figure of the Bodhisattva, invoked at the beginning of the Republic's Kat Eben, in association with Socrates, is also an offer in Plato's portrayals of Socrates and even in the collective portraits of the Socratic logoi as a whole. At the very least, the evidence of Plato's apology shows that it is counterintuitive to interpret the ethical exhortations of Socrates as motivated by his pursuit of his own happiness. In fact, one of the least studied aspects of Plato's Socrates is the concern that Socrates shows for the welfare of all the members of his community. I guess I could conclude with this quote from the Apology. Socrates says that he approaches each citizen like a father or elder brother, and that in so doing he has had to neglect all of his own affairs, Amao too. We have seen that the elenchus, the Socratic conversation that involves an examination of the interlocutor's ethical beliefs, often involves Socrates bringing to mind this awareness about the desires of all persons. Well, does anybody want to be unhappy and unfortunate? Meno, I suppose not. Socrates. Then if so, nobody desires what is evil. Perhaps what motivates Socrates is not the desire to teach an ethics of me first to his interlocutors. Rather, Socrates shares with Shantideva's bodhisattva a commitment to the welfare of all persons, while Socrates shares with Shantideva the desire to mature the ethical commitments of his interlocutors, bringing them from what initially might appear to be a primitive egoism to a greater concern for the welfare of all other persons. The first step in this reform is related to the inculcation of the principle of equality that we see invoked in the passage from the Meno, the sama dukha sukhaa sarveheh, the equality of all beings with respect to well-being and suffering. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Everybody else is muted, so I'm applauding on behalf of all of us.
Okay.
And now I invite you to raise your hand and let's have some discussion.
Okay, I'm just gonna.
Rusty Jones.
Hi, Sarah. Lovely talk. Thank you for that.
Sure.
I wanted to ask you whether Shantideva might some other insight into reading Plato. So one, I agree with you that a recognition that everyone desires to be happy places some kinds of constraints on the ways we can act and should lead us to recognize that their interests are like our own. But I think one of the things that Plato is concerned about is what happens when there seems to be a conflict between the tradition that you're looking at speaks to the kinds of answers that we could give to someone who says, yeah, I recognize that other people's interests are significant here, but when it comes to a conflict, I'm just going to prefer my own.
Thank you. I see that you have some horses behind you. That's cool. Anyway, yeah. So, right. So I guess you're saying that when we're arguing with like a Thrasymachus or a Callicles or somebody who says, yeah, I mean, there may be other people, they may be suffering, but I'm not particularly interested in their suffering. So I think that in the Bodhicaryaavatara, the work of chapter 8 is, he says, one must earnestly meditate on the sameness. All beings are like myself in that they all wish to be free from suffering. So I guess, you know, I think there's some kind of work involved in that. And that if you're not like maybe willing to pause, to think about it, to really put yourself in their place, that it's possible that, yeah, you won't really be that interested in that. And I won't really be able to convince you. I mean, I think that's what Plato says in the Crito when he says, you know, we agree that you shouldn't harm, and people who don't share this agreement, we're not really in a community with each other. So I guess I would say that maybe I don't know that like maybe that person, I'm not sure how I'd get across to that person, but I think that's a really good question. I'm sorry that I don't have a good answer. Do you want to follow through with, or do you have some ideas that are better?
Yeah, maybe if I could follow up. It's not an idea, it's just another way to put the question, I think. Is it the case that this kind of commitment is compatible with a fairly strict intellectualism about virtue? So is it the case that if you meditate, as you put it, in the right way, if you think on these matters, you'll come to a recognition that will automatically lead to some kind of action or some kind of commitment on your part? Or is it the case that that meditating on the sameness of others is a way to lead to some kind of commitment which goes beyond strictly recognizing that they care about their well-being as much as you care about yours?
And right, and so that is what I am actually, what I actually am saying is that in the Socratic dialogue, I think that is what Plato is trying to do, is to mature people from a sort of grasping at their own desires, like I really want this and it matters so much, to a kind of detachment, a kind of community of those who will the good. And you can see this, for example, in Socrates' treatment of Thrasymachus, right? He's his friend, and Thrasymachus says to listen to him. He says, you know, we have to help Thrasymachus understand this. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there's the activity of Socrates is about facilitating both the maturing of people's thoughts and commitments and desires, so that they're less greedy and needy and more guardian-like. Absolutely, I think that, yeah.
Victor Sines.
Okay.
Great, thank you so much for that talk. I was wondering if you might comment a little bit more about how you're understanding kind of egoism and eudaimonism in this sense. So I'm thinking about, you know, the Irwin quote that you mentioned. So I think, best as I understand it, that's like at one very far extreme of possible interpretations. But I'm thinking, like, here's maybe two senses in which you could think a reading might be eudaimonist. So one is that at the end of the day, you know, the life in question is my life, right? So we've got this, you know, this tradition of a bios in ancient philosophy, and at the end of the day, on that tradition, you know, I'm the one who's responsible for making a choice of what life I'm going to live, right? So that's one sense of eudaimonist. And I guess the second sense, which you alluded to, and I'd love to hear what you have to say, is, you know, there's a sense in which, for example, the Plato of the Gorgias, you know, the choosing the right kind of life is ultimately a benefit to me, right? Even if that's not the reason why I'm helping my friend, you know, it does turn out that in helping my friend, you know, I am bringing in virtue in my soul, and by contrast, and as you helpfully pointed out, you know, in committing injustice, right, I am ultimately harming myself. So I wonder if you might just comment on that, vis-a-vis both your interpretation of Socrates and, you know, your reading of these other texts.
Yeah. So again, it's kind of a long story, and there's, but okay, I'll say a few things. First of all, I definitely, this is just a much longer discussion, and I'm really sorry that, to just sort of bracket it, but to talk about me and my life, I hope that the arguments from transmigration demonstrate that that is a super narrow way of looking at things, right? And that, at least when I'm talking about my life, do I mean, me as an embodied historical being? Do I mean my intellect? And I think about, why should I, so there's all, already to talk about self-interest in my life, then, we'll need to have a discussion about what that is. And to say that, well, I'm only thinking of myself as my narrow individual self in the sense of the time that takes place between my birth in 1960 and the few years that I have remaining left. And that's the stretch of time that matters most to me. I'm going to stipulate that's myself. Like, I wouldn't, I think that that's problematic for a Platonist. It's problematic in so many ways. And the second thing is, again, I'd like to say that, the figure of Socrates, he says, I've neglected myself. I'm caring for you. I think other people here, back me up, people in the symposium, right? Aeschines, right? He says, I tried to make him better out of my love for him. So eros, as it's defined in Posthumous Academy, as a divine disposition for the care of the youth. So what flows through the Socratic persona could be a larger eros that actually flows from a more universal source. So, there are background considerations here. Now, when you mention, ultimately it's my life and I want to benefit myself, as much as possible by doing good to myself. And the way that I'll do that is by avoiding harming other people. I definitely think that is an argument that Plato makes. He makes that to Crito. He says, boy, Crito, if you mess up your soul, you're really going to be messed up, But that's because Crito's a businessman, He's like, that's a bad deal, Why does he bother telling us that Crito is, so easily bribable and so interested in bribing? And he's like, I don't know. You're the businessman. It's like Trump, you're supposed to be making a good deal here. And that just sucks. That's the art of the bad deal. So I don't think that those dialectical persuasions have any, I definitely think he's talking to interlocutors who have dispositions, but that they need to be matured. They need to be matured, right? That's the whole point. You're bringing people along. You start from where they are. That's my view. Okay.
Sarah Monison.
Hi, I just had to unmute myself.
Hello, how are you? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Nice to see everybody here. And thank you to the Society for organizing these things. That was a splendid talk. I found myself riveted throughout. And I wanted to, let me see if I can put this succinctly so that we can get to many more questions. I was really struck by the way you used kataben, the frame of the whole Republic, as a sort of great paradox that is worked out through the entire argument of the text, and how you said it sort of when the philosopher has to choose to take on all those bureaucratic responsibilities after preparing him or herself for all of the happiness through all of the different things that that she's done, that it brings a tsunami of unhappiness. He said, I guess that's supposed to be to the soul of the individual philosopher who was at that point. Mm-hmm. But I just wanted to ask, if we factor in Plato's understanding of political power, mm-hmm. and Plato's understanding of the logic of power, as well as his understanding of the intimate, organic connections between people, which I think you laid out really beautifully. If we factor in the understanding of political power, then the tsunami of unhappiness actually flows from the absence of philosophic discernment and judgment, mm-hmm. guiding power. And actually, so that by choosing to take a turn in rotation with a small group and exercise power, there is a way in which the philosopher is actually reducing suffering
for
of
others,
himself and of all of the others. And I think this comes out beautifully also in the other passage you drew our attention to, which is the in the myth of air, the immature person who jumps at the tyranny. Yes, I think you're right that we're supposed to have compassion and pity for that immature, especially because it's an immature person, right? I mean, because it might be an adult, but they don't have the philosophical, training to be able to make a good assessment of the choices before them. So in that sense, it's immature. But I think, shouldn't we also have compassion for, I mean, if that person is rising to a tyranny, then we need to also have compassion for all the other people that are going to suffer from the abuses of power. So I'll stop now and just say that I really found your talk made me think about things in a very fruitful way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I mean, I like this idea that the philosopher, by agreeing to be a part-time bureaucrat, will alleviate the suffering of her fellow philosophers, because they won't have to do that, that work. It's kind of like you're chair of your department, right? So, like, then you can't write, so you just do that, and that's a favor. That's good. Yeah, I like that idea of service. And I definitely, I feel like I have to integrate that idea of service into my reading of the Republic much more, because I am very struck by just the figure of the Bodhisattva, the one who comes to liberate. It just seems to me that the figure of Socrates is that figure of the one who comes to serve others, and that that's a paradigm, and that is the Socratic event that all of these Socratic logo are meant to document in some way, and that if he is a figure, if he is a paradigm, he couldn't be teaching the gospel of me first. That just, I find it loathsome, and but yeah, so thank you for your question.
Charles Goodman.
Yes, thank you. So I entirely agree that when we're thinking about Shantideva, really top of mind should be this question of whether what he's advocating is this subtle form of the gospel of me first that Victor was talking about, where what I'm primarily concerned about is maximizing my own well-being, where that well-being is considered to include virtue as a key constituent, right? But I think that the argument you gave having to do with reincarnation really is not going to rule out that perspective, because possibly unlike Plato, Shantideva is going to think that at least under some circumstances, an action I take now is going to have lots of implications for my well-being across many lives in the future, right? Through karma. And then also, if I am, a really good Buddhist practitioner and I cultivate virtue now, that might result in me practicing the Buddhist path for many lifetimes in the future, right? So that's actually, the reincarnation part isn't going to do that. And I think actually that what Shantideva seems to be trying to appeal to, as for example, in chapter 8, verse 101, which is right in the middle of what you quoted, but you didn't cite that one.
Yeah, okay, let's take a look at that.
Is the Buddhist view of personal identity, right? So the continuum of consciousness, like a queue, and the combination of constituents, like an army, are not real. The person who experiences suffering does not exist. To whom will that suffering belong, right? So unlike Williams, who sees that as a big problem for Shantideva, I think Shantideva, from his own perspective, thinks that's driving the argument. And one more point, that's clearly not in Plato, right? The unfortunate, naive guy coming from heaven who chooses to be a tyrant. The tyrant will maybe have a different personality from him, but there's this, it seems like in Plato, there's this continuate substance that is identical between the naive chooser and the tyrant.
the substance.
Right. So for Shantideva, it seems like the explanation of why it's not the virtue-infused gospel of me first has to have to do with the fact that there's no self-identical substance that's here now and will be exactly the same in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that, I mean, of course, the doctrine of anatta, there is no self. And so since there is no owner of states of weal and woe, there's no point in privileging myself as an owner of states of weal and woe, because there's no self there. It's sort of, that's just a fiction. It's like, it's like, you know, it would be like caring about what color my unicorn saddle is. I mean, it makes no difference. It doesn't exist. So for sure. And I do see that, you know, people have talked a lot of, you know, the soul is a substance, it's eternal, for sure. That's absolutely true. But again, I guess I would say that, you know, and I would say that overall the comparison between Platonism and Buddhism, a lot of people are stuck on this, you know, thing about, you know, the idea of the form, of having this absolute eternal quality, how there's no eternity, you know, in Buddhism, there's no real, you know, thing at all. There's emptiness, for sure. That's true. I do think that the distinction between what the philosopher knows as conventional reality, and especially the attribution of reality to particulars in the world, is a conventional view that the philosopher will transcend in just the same way that Shantideva will distinguish between the conventional and absolute reality, that there's a huge parallel there. And included within that would be the recognition of individual identity as such, both for the Platonist and for the Buddhist. And that when the Platonist says that there is no essence to my individuality because only the form has essence, I as an individual have no essence, have no substance, that rings true. And that is something that a Shantideva could accept. And I think there's actually a lot more ground there for them to share. So I would just kind of say that briefly but I really, I love that you brought up Williams and Shantideva, and, you know, I'm very eager to explore kind of these books in a larger way. And what I'm very interested in, especially, though I didn't have time to talk about it, is the way that in the Republic, the form of the good, as that which is epikeina tes ousia, beyond essence, is juxtaposed with the kind of metaphysical frame of illumination and the soul as being the most sun-like creature, with this whole dialogue between the madhymaka and the yogacara. And there's just a lot more to be said about those things too. So thank you very much for your question.
Professor Boeri.
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted. Joy?
Okay, thank you so much for your talk and for introducing Shantideva.
Yeah, Shantideva.
A very strange author to me.
Very strange.
Yeah. It's very strange, yes. It's very interesting, the parallels you established. The most interesting parallel, in my view, is that one related to the idea that, well, if we can say, well, according to Plato, Socrates, all people wish to do well. Nobody disagrees about whether or not one wishes to do well. And on his part, Shantideva argues that suffering should be prevented because everyone agrees, right? But these are two different, very different, in my view, kinds of agreements, right?
Can you,
maybe it's a very naive question, because I don't understand very well what Shantideva means when he says that, for example, suffering must be eliminated. So could you develop a little more that point? Thank you.
I mean, yeah, they are really different, and it's true. I guess what you're saying is, look, there's only one reason for suffering to be eliminated. That's because someone's suffering. Presumably, we eliminate suffering to benefit somebody, and that person that we're benefiting is a real, it matters to them. It's like, hey, I'm suffering. I want if suffering just belonged to no one, if it affected no one, if it were just like a cloud in the sky and had absolutely no bearing on anyone, you would need to eliminate it. It would just be like, rayon or some kind of gas that just wouldn't have any effect. But the fact that people are breathing it in and need to be rescued from it, that fact makes it very personal. And it's only because it's personal that suffering needs to be eliminated. And the whole idea of impersonal suffering is sort of crazy. Is that what you're saying?
Something like that. Yes, thank you.
I agree. Yeah. Honestly, I don't know. I think,
it's a very complicated issue. I'm trying to figure out what you mean, or what Shantideva means when he says something like suffering must be eliminated. Okay, that's a very interesting program for your wife. But we know, or I think Plato, Socrates thinks that suffering cannot be eliminated at all. You can do some things in order to neutralize pain, for instance, psychological, physical pain, and so on, but not eliminated completely suffering in your life. Or
Well, the Buddha doesn't. The Buddha talks about, life is suffering. Suffering is caused by desire. There's a way out of suffering, and I generally do think that, for sure, Plato is talking about the way out of suffering. And I don't think that the way out of suffering is by maximizing my own good. Partly because I think that it does involve a huge distortion about the nature of reality and about the meaning of self and other. And but I would say that but I agree with you. I agree with you for sure that it sort of doesn't, that the idea of ownerless suffering, it doesn't seem like if suffering is truly ownerless, like we'd really have to worry about it that much. I absolutely agree with you there. And it would be like air pollution that on planet Mars, like I don't have to worry about that, because no one is breathing that. So that's not my problem.
Thank you. Thank you. That helps a lot. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay, William Altman.
Oh, there's William. Hi, William.
Hey, Sarah.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you. What a great talk.
Thank you.
And first just with Don Morrison here, and who's worked on this altruism, Rosalind Weiss, and you're our queen. I mean, that was beautiful for all of us that are fighting against this eudaimonist dogma. Just beautiful. I want to look more back to the past rather than to the future of coming lives, because you never mentioned the theory of recollection. And it seems to me that Plato's actual strategy for getting us to deconstruct eudaimonism is not so much on the basis of future lives, but really on the basis of the basic human awareness of every decent person on the planet that knows that looking out for number one is not what nobility is all about. Like any self-interested jerk can look out for number one. But we all somehow know that the people that are facing the COVID virus right now on the front line are doing something noble. In other words, so I'd like to think if you will go back with me to a basic human awareness that egoistic eudaimonism is unworthy of a human being. And to give you just three things to respond to. First of all, starting with Vlastos, I think it's interesting that Vlastos didn't refuse to make Euthydemus one of the Socratic dialogues, precisely because that eudaimonistic premise of everybody desires to euprotein is uncontested. In other words, that Vlastos, I think, was kind of confused. He wants the eudaimonist axiom, but on the other hand, he doesn't want Euthydemus to be a strictly Socratic dialogue. And it seems to me that the first thing I'd like to hear if you talk about a little bit is about euprotein, about how that's an equivocation. Like just because everybody desires to be happy doesn't mean everybody desires to do the right thing. And to me, that's a way that he's reminding us that eudaimonism is limited. Second way, the text from the Meno that you gave. I've been working a lot on Xenophon and the idea that Plato is channeling Xenophon's Anabasis, where Meno actually in Xenophon's Anabasis says he ethelein adikain, like he literally desires to do injustice.
Yeah.
So to have him get converted to a kind of Penner-Rowe type of eudaimonistic egotism at 77, 78 is a completely hollow victory, because we know that Meno is a shithead.
Yeah.
The third thing is about just the idea of the good. And this is really what I want you to respond to, Sarah.
It's a lot. Okay, so I just want you to say, because, you're talking about a lot of things, right, that you've obviously talked about. But okay.
You may need to pick one, Sarah, so that I could get on to other questions.
Yeah, just pick one. But let me give you the last from the menu, which is that the reason that Plato doesn't have to say anything about the idea of the good is because he so effectively lured you into thinking that eudaimonism and eudaimonia is the good, that all he needs to say is that it's not that it's the good itself. It's the non-dative good. It's the good that makes altruistic action possible precisely because it's not eudaimonia. And that he doesn't need to say that it's cosmos, harmony, order, beauty, because all it is that which is not self-interested.
I see. So, in other words, the very essence of the divine, the good, is that which is not selfish, that which attends to others, that which benefits others. That's its property. That's its essential nature, is to do good to others. That there's that it's to benefit, to be of benefit, is to be good. And so, is that kind of what you're saying?
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I definitely think that, this is definitely related to the whole idea of the bodhisattva, right? The person who wills the good. And I definitely think this is related to the idea of the Socratic community of bringing together people who will the good, right? They are then imitating Socrates, who's sort of, in that sense, acting as the demiurge on their matter. They are recipients of the good, but in being recipients of his good, he brings them to maturation. He brings them into a less selfish place. And I agree that the people in the dialogues, Meno and Polis, are psychopaths. I mean, they're very Trumpian. I mean, they're very unappealing. It seems strange. I think that I've always felt that, again, this is my reading of Socrates, that these are always within ourselves. That at any given moment, we have our inner Meno and our inner Alcibiades. At any moment, we have the capacity to move into a less selfish place. And always Socrates is the light within. It's never about real creeps. I mean, there are real creeps in the world, for sure. But for us to read the dialogues as if other people were the creeps would be to miss a huge benefit. But thank you so much. I would love to read what you're writing lately, and send it to me. And yeah, thank you so much for your questions.
Okay, next, Paul Scholmeyer.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Sarah, for a very insightful and interesting paper. I'd like to ask you about a couple of passages that you didn't discuss in the paper and see what you might have to say about them. And these passages came to mind because it seems to me your paper might have a remnant of egoism in it.
Okay.
The passages that I have in mind are in book 5 that you touched on briefly. At least I think it's in book 5. It's been a while since I've read the Republic, although I'll be teaching it next month, in fact. But at the beginning of book 5, I think, or maybe it's at the end of book 4, Socrates says, well, the guardians won't have any property, of course. And then Adeimantus probably is objects. Well, how are they going to be happy if they don't have any property? And Socrates replies, well, look, we're not talking about the happiness of any individuals here. We're talking about the happiness of society as a whole. And so they're part of this larger whole. And he goes on to criticize the potter, especially, and the farmer. They shouldn't spend their time feasting and going to festivals and so on. They have a job to do. In fact, if they require too much wealth, they won't be able to do their job. So happiness is tied to this social function. It's not an individual happiness. And further, when he discusses the family, further on in book 5, he compares society to the human body,
Yeah.
If I think you used the analogy of a finger, if you feel pain in your finger, your whole body feels it in the same way. If one individual is suffering, the whole society suffers.
Yes.
So it seems to me you might argue, I don't know if the Buddhists would agree with this or not, that there's a doctrine of no self there. That is, there's no individual self, but there's this grander self, if you like.
Yes, I fully agree with you. And I tried to bring that up at the end that, I definitely think that when he says that we will prohibit the citizen from saying, I'm doing well, that those first person statements will be prohibited. We will only allow it is well with us. I think he is pointing to that. And I do think that he is very critical. He is asking us to look into the nature of self and bringing up issues of what is the self. Definitely, what is the self? I think self-knowledge is the foundation of Socratic philosophy. And we haven't even touched on that. But definitely at the heart of everything is this question of what the self is, what the true self is. Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more.
Thank you.
Okay, next, Phil Mitzis. Are you zooming in from Greece?
Yeah, there it is, right behind you. I'm about probably 100 yards from where Socrates
My gosh, that is amazing.
Well, pretty soon the museum is you'll see all the sculptures when the lights come on.
Oh, right. Oh, really? Wow.
But anyway, I really admire the fact that you're doing this kind of comparative work. And of course, one of the dangers with comparative work is that we're talking about all these sort of comparisons in English. And this is sort of a follow-up on Marcello's question, and that is the question about suffering. So,
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of your paper, you were saying, well, we have the Stoic cosmopolis, and we have these kinds of connections with people in the Stoic cosmopolis, and Shantideva is interested in these, the way we connect to others. But certainly a Stoic is going to say, I don't care about your suffering. I don't care about my suffering. I don't really care about suffering. I care about our rational moral attainments.
Of course.
So I think there you would have a really deep divide on the question of suffering. And then then the question would be, well, how far can we read that back into Socrates?
Of course.
The way the Stoics did. I mean, when Socrates is talking about suffering, is he talking about the conventional kind of, suffering that Shantideva is talking about with subhava, or is he really more worried about moral suffering, moral error, etc., so that when we're really talking about suffering, making a kind of connection between people, we're not talking about the same thing when we're talking about the Greeks and we're talking about,
the Indians.
Shantideva.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. And, I would say that, the figure of the Buddha as somebody who comes to enlighten the ignorant person, to save them from the rounds of birth and death. I mean, Plato, there is that in Plato, right? To save us from birth and death, right? The philosopher gets off the wheel of birth and death. Ultimately, to all of this up and down is kind of like not to the point, right? To establish us in equanimity, to introduce us to our true self, our true nature, which is, we could say the mind, to get us to practice some detachment. And, I think in that way, Socrates would heal people, not by feeding them or clothing them, but by talking to them, right? By developing them, helping them progress along the path towards self-knowledge. And definitely for the Stoics too, that is the path of virtue, the path of virtue. And I definitely think that this, oikeiosis, the expansion of rational care for all beings is a very similar trajectory. So I'm not really seeing that much difference. I think for human beings, suffering is ignorance ultimately, and suffering is to be attached to our selfish desires, and just getting more of things temporarily so that we can feel that our desires are abated somehow is a very temporary solution. It's not going to work. It's not going to work whether we're Greek or Indian. It's just not going to work. There has to be a deeper solution, right? I think we agree about that.
Yeah. I just thought that that Shantideva was talking about more conventional kinds of sufferings rather than.
Well, no, the Bodhisattva is devoted. That's what I'm saying. The whole Bodhisattva image.
No, I got that now. That's
to
good.
Enlighten, to wake people up.
Okay.
Yeah.
One last question, Ekaterini Levka.
Hello to all, and thank you very much for your wonderful speech, which gave us the opportunity of thinking more and in a larger way, many things. I would go towards the same direction as Professor Bori and our last speaker, Mr. Mitis. Although I agree with you with your insight and the way you try to put in parallel the two ways of thinking, which I believe indeed they are very, very equivalent, I wonder if the argument of being against suffering, trying to eliminate suffering wherever it goes, from wherever it comes and for whom it might concern, I wonder if this doesn't reduce eudaimonism to a simple hedonism. If the evil is only suffering, then good is only pleasure. And there are sufferings that are physical or moral sufferings sometimes that can be beneficial for people. Let's say an athlete who will suffer with his body to become better in the future, or even when we speak about the punishments of people who have done things that are not correct and justice comes to make them think again by suffering the results of their actions and make them better. So I don't know if it is enough to stay only to this, that suffering is a common ground for everybody, suffering should be eliminated, and this should be also the objective of the philosopher in a Socratic vision. Could you please comment a little more on it? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, and I do think that it gets back to Altman's question about what is o pratein, what is it to fare well? So, ultimately suffering is ignorance, and suffering is to be subject to desire, and suffering is to be selfish. That is the meaning of suffering, meaning that I am limited to a state where I'm conditioned by my own individuality and limited by all kinds of things that condition me, and that I mistake my true self for my false self, that I'm identified with that. And so, ultimately, to bring about the maturation of beings is to bring them into a deeper sense of self-realization. That's what the Buddha taught. He did through meditation. That's what Socrates taught. He did it through dialectic. And the only way to alleviate suffering is to teach. The only way to alleviate suffering is through knowledge. So that is ultimate suffering. Now, I do think that that compassion. I think that this awareness of other people's suffering, like I see this as so Socratic. The fact that he's there to remind us. He's our older brother. He's there. He says, I'm neglecting myself. I'm there to alleviate your suffering. And that is the meaning of the good, to be self-extensive, to not be selfish, to not be self-clinging. And so and I think these are forms of practice. The Buddha supposedly, before he became the Buddha, spent lives as a bodhisattva. He fed himself to hungry lions as part of his practice. He would see a hungry lion crossing his path. He would turn himself into food. That would be like one lifetime. He over and over again surrendered self, over and over again ministered to the needs of sentient beings. And I think that, as practice, it is very important to attend to the needs of others. That is a great way. Those of us who are parents know that. A great way to be less selfish, a great way to become more mature. And they're not really separate. I'm sure you know that.
Thank you.
All right. Well, let's all thank our speaker. And let me just say 2 or 3 sentences in closing, because this summer colloquium series is now finished, and it's been very gratifying to me to put it on. A number of you have been regulars, coming to most of them, and I'm delighted that you found it worth your time. I'm putting together a selection of talks for the fall. A couple of the fall speakers are actually here. You'll be getting notices, and I hope that you'll join us again starting September 2nd. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much.